Okay, so I've got a very special guest with us today. It's my coach and mentor of about 10 years, Andrew from Know and Do. You all right, mate?
Hi, Dave. Good to see you, as
Good to
always.
see you, as always. Right, we've got a lot to dig through here, but can we just start with a brief kind of outline to Know and Do and what you guys do?
Yeah, sure. Know and Do's been around for 15 years now. Myself and a business partner, Bernard. Three core strands to us: coaching, consultancy, and training. And that's all around mainly business support. We do work with some individuals, but it's all about supporting businesses. And there's a clue in the title, which is Know and Do. And that was formed on the basis of take knowledge and do something with it. So we're very much about applied learning and making things happen in a way which generates results and the right results for people.
See that you've already answered two questions there because I was going to ask you to explain the Know and Do this. Typical, you one step ahead of us. Right, okay, now I've heard this story before, but let's go back a bit to where, your first influence in business, I suppose, which was that McDonald's?
First proper job was at McDonald's.
Yeah.
A couple of pals had a job there, and school wasn't something that I was very keen on. One of my pals said, "Well, you've got a Saturday job." He said, "It's great. You go along, you get free food, and there's loads of girls." I was 16, so I was kind of in, and it was a really interesting environment to work in because they've got processes and manuals for everything. So at 16, you turn up and you just do what they tell you to do. And then I followed procedures and they give you a star and, you get another star and another star. And then you just followed those. And I found out I was good at I could follow things quite easily. And then I was very good at selling stuff. I held a record in the store for selling, the amount of, I did 8 £1,000 hours back to back. And back in the day, the average burger was probably about 56p or something. So imagine the volume of food that we had to give to customers. So, and I moved from that store. I was picked actually off the back of that to be part of a competition in the Northwest to find the best people on the tills. And off the back of that, I was asked to go and help be part of they called it the training crew, to open up the first drive-through McDonald's in the UK, which was in Fallowfield in Manchester.
So McDonald's obviously had a big influence there, and then how much? That's quite a jump, I think. But do you know where you work, like at the university with MISPA? Is that correct? So how big of a gap was that in the middle? What did you do in the middle between McDonald's and MISPA?
Quite a few things. I ended up being a junior manager at McDonald's. So at 18, I had the white shirts on, the keys for the store, and I was a shift running manager. I mean, that blows my mind looking back at that, because that was at the time you were dealing with cash. So right. At the end of an evening, there'd be literally, maybe 15, 20 grand on the table. And I'm an 18-year-old sort of, going through this, filling in my book and my ledger. And so, I thought, this is great. You're learning a lot. And then on the way home from McDonald's one night, I was involved in a car accident, which proved to be fatal for the person I was in with. And I think that sort of began to change my mind a bit, because it literally, I'd swap seats with somebody. And because I swapped seats, I'm here now. And I think from that perspective, I'd looked at McDonald's and thought, where can I go? At 18, I was stuck. I couldn't go salaried at the time until I was 21. So I'd have another 3 years of clocking in. And there was something there where I was like, having just literally, had one of those moments when, a small quirk of fate saves you. I thought, is this all there is? So I started looking for other things. I actually went to train to become a patisserie chef. Trained under a Swiss guy who loved what he did and was very, very good, but I just couldn't get as excited about patisseries as he was. And I realised that what I was missing was that face-to-face interaction. So I got into sales, saw an advert, applied, and got into selling telephone systems and fax machines. That was great, did it for 2 years. Learned an awful lot off it was two brothers who ran the business, and they were just brilliant. I would have said they were natural born salespeople, but every time I went out with them, they were giving me a book and a tape, and you suddenly realised they just lived, breathed, and ate sales. And all these books they kept giving me, I was like, oh, this is great. And I went down the rabbit hole into sales psychology, and I really loved exploring that side of it. And off the back of that, I then realised that one of the, I suppose, talents or gifts I had was I was quite intuitive and could read people very easily. And I wanted to know how to work on that and develop it. And then that also then involved figuring out how the brain worked, and I thought this is really interesting stuff. My learning journey at school hadn't been great. I failed more exams than I actually passed. And once I'd figured out how my brain worked, I then went about sort of absorbing learning, and then took myself to university. Did 2 A-levels back-to-back in a year, went to university and applied all of these processes and systems I've learned along the way and got the first. So it was, I'd say it was pretty easy to do. Not from a point of view of look at me, but once you figured out this is a system, and my thinking was, how do I work the system? And then people would give you feedback on that. And of course, off we went. But there was a lot of psychology behind it. From there, I ended up, I was going to go back to the university, do some postgrad work, and the IRA blew Manchester up, which at the time, that's where I got my income. So I had to find a job. I got the Yellow Pages out, literally, rang around and chanced across somebody who was looking for exactly the sort of person I was at the time. So I went to work for them for about 18 months. They were a small startup, and they exposed me to working with some larger companies. They had good ideas, but unfortunately, it wasn't the place to stay. So I ended up going back to the university, and the university wanted that combination of sales experience because it was after growing more commercially. And sport and exercise science, which is what I did at university, was really developing as a field and growing quite rapidly. And then when Manchester got awarded the Commonwealth Games, I was asked to be part of a unit that to see if we could support the city council, which we did. And again, sales experience came in. And then met them, went out for lunch, and a few weeks later we had a contract in place. And then that team evolved, and I ended up looking after it. And we became a self-funded independent research unit sitting within the university.
I mean, sales has always been something I've kind of gleaned from you. I think very early on when I first met you, that was something that was what interested me, and you coaching me, really. That's where we started. Because there was Chris Greener, if you remember Chris Greener, back in the day. He introduced me to you. I reached out to Chris the other day. He works in construction now. He's a project manager, but shout out to Chris. But I remember the first few kind of sessions we had. We kind of taught me through sales and what it is, and techniques and stuff like that. But for people watching or listening now, how would you, if you had somebody sat with you now, like an SME, a business owner, or somebody like in sales or getting into sales, where would you start in honing the kind of sales skills? What's the first step that you would take people through? Or does it depend person to person?
No, I think there is a generic element here, Dave, and it's a great question. And I suppose it's one of the questions everybody struggles. And I've developed a sales course, which we've now delivered to, probably 3,000 plus businesses, because I think that there are lots of people that struggle with this whole concept of sales. And I think the first point for me is that most people don't like sales. One of the first questions I ask people when they're sat at the course is, if I said to you, do you like, love or loathe sales, where would you rank yourself? And I'd probably say, over 70% see themselves closer to loathe than like. Very few people love sales, but when you actually break it down, what they talk about when they talk about sales is a negative experience of sales. So they've got this frame that when you say sales, they picture an image of something that's negative and not good. And when I ask them for examples of sales, they give me examples of where they've been pestered, cold called, ripped off, a dodgy contract. And again, I think that is perpetuated in the media, where the media says, salesperson rips off old customer, 90-year-old customer, when it's not. That's a scammer or a con artist that's ripped somebody off, but they use the title sales, and therefore I think sales has become very negatively perceived, and lots of businesses that I talk to say, well, I know I need to do it, but I don't want to be pushy. And of course, from a psychological perspective, if they're thinking about being pushy and negative, they pull all the attributes of what that type of, and that then forms the way that they view it. And of course, they come across in a kind of awkward way because they're trying to not be something, but in order to not do something, you need to think of doing it in the first place.
Yeah. Once I'm having a bit of a coughing fit here, so I'll edit this out. This is cool. I captured all that. I kept me coughing, so that's good. Yeah, so on that's an interesting point you raised there, actually, because when I've asked people that question before, right? Because sales it's quite a telling question. It tells you a lot about somebody in terms of not about somebody, sorry, a lot about a business, how they kind of approach the sales process. But they normally start with process or some kind of strategy or something like that. But that's a really good point. Like if you're closer to loathing something, then you're not really going to be, what is it? You're not really going to be on the route to kind of master it or make use of it if you don't really like it. But then I've met people as well who really do like and some that love sales. But it's a really good point, that, because I've had people that work for me, and I can say something to them and to do with like speaking to a client, and it'll be in the arena of sales, and you could just see them recoiling back away from it, because it's almost like my experience is people have, I don't know, felt like people judge them if they ask for a sale, But the bottom line is, if you're selling something of value, you're actually helping someone, right? That's kind of the way I would look at it. If you're selling something of value, then you're helping somebody. But I'd say most people I've come across when I've talked about sales, you are right. Like quite a lot of people edge towards loathing it, which is interesting. Yeah.
No, I was just going to say that, I think some of that is subconscious from individuals, and it's not until you bring it out and allow them to observe themselves and their perspective on it that they really take a hold of it and go, oh, okay, yeah, no, I see what you mean. And once it's said, it's kind of, well, duh, of course that makes sense. But they hadn't appreciated it because they've been looking at it from a different perspective.
And what have you got any? When you've spoken to me about a few people over the years, like, because you something I like about you is you are always continuously learning yourself, aren't you? Constantly evolving. In kind of the sales arena, who would you recommend people follow online, or any books they could read or anything like that, or resources that you have that will kind of help them in that? People that do kind of like sales, not love it.
Yeah, we've only got a short time for the podcast, Dave. And the reason I say that is someone asked me once, can I have your reading list? And at the time it was sort of 3,000 plus. So I said, you can, but are you going to invest in that? And the answer is probably no.
Yeah.
I think there are some people that do stand out. There are some things that stand the test of time, but I think it's a bit like fitness. What you have to do is you have to hone in on what particular attribute do I want to improve here? And can I get some general information in the first instance? And then can I start to really hone in and maybe target? Because it could be questioning skills, so that's a communication strategy. It could actually be process or product knowledge. Well, that's a training issue. So I think that for me, there's something we use is skills, knowledge, attitude, and routines. So I'd be thinking, what's the skills deficit here? And what knowledge do I need to become aware of and take a hold of? And the other thing is when it comes to attitude or sort of mindset, people use lots of different terms, grit, resilience, all of these, But if your attitude is getting in the way, then your skills and your knowledge aren't going to do anything. I could show you how to do it, but if you don't believe in it, you're not going to do it. And then the routine for me, that comes down to practice, but it's not just practice, it's deliberate practice. And so it's working on it, rehearsing it. So, one of the things I do if I'm in a business is I'll rehearse scripts, get people to train and do things, because you'll fall to the level of your training, all of the time. And, people thought that was a quote attributed to the US SEALs or something. It's not. It was the Greeks who gave us that, thousands of years ago. And I think people have to train, and they don't do enough of that. And you can
Yeah.
train internally and then take it externally. But the other thing I would say about sales as well, and this picks up the point around mindset and resilience, is, people don't call themselves a salesperson. And I think there's a difference between what I call a salesperson and a sales professional. And a sales professional, as a sales professional, my first priority, ethical, legal, moral. Is everything I'm going to do ethical? Is it legal? Is it moral? Great. Now I start to think about, okay, what skills do I need and how do I develop those to perform as a professional? Because it's a profession, and it's a fantastic profession if it's done right. A salesperson doesn't invest in their training, doesn't invest in themselves, and therefore will struggle with sales. And that's when a lot of people go, oh, well, sales, it's I don't want to be like that. I don't want to be ripping people off or something. And it's just a smokescreen for the fact they've not developed their skills and they've not pushed themselves forward. And, that comes back full circle to what you said about the training.
Yeah.
And then identifying some of the key books that really help people. I think probably one of the number one books I recommend is The Sales Machine by a guy called Chet Holmes. He's unfortunately passed on. That's a fantastic book, and I think it's a good start point. But there are loads as well, and some of them, the origins go back into the 1920s and 1930s. And they still talk about sales, but this is no internet, it's no social media, but sales principles I think are exactly the same, because people still buy from people they know, like, and trust. So, whatever medium we use, it's about building on those basics and those foundations and then improving the skills. I mean, as an ex-professional footballer, you've probably worked with people who had the raw skill or talent, but didn't develop themselves because they didn't put the work in.
Do you think in terms of, like, generally speaking, do people have like some kind of cognitive bias towards sales because they've been somebody's approached them that they don't know, that they don't like, and they don't trust? Do you think there's a bit of that plays a part, that when people look at sales and don't want to be like that, surely that they've got an idea in their head of what sales is, which isn't always accurate, because there are good salespeople that you do know, you do like, and you do trust. So do you think there's some cognitive bias there with people?
Yeah, massive. And again, picking up exactly what you've said, and for me, this is one of the skills of sales. We've got to watch for patterns of language. People have got to think about what they want, not what they don't want.
Yeah.
And too many people start off with saying, well, I don't want to be like that. Well, don't then. But, you asked the question before about sales in a business. A lot of the time people struggle with sales because they say, so what are you aiming for? What do you want your business to do? And and then they're not sure. But if they could say to me, I want my business to turn over X, or if I'm a single-handed business owner, they might say, well, I want to earn 50,000. Great. So if you want to earn 50,000, your business might have to turn over, say, 80,000 or 90,000. And then we work out what they want the business to do, because then I can reverse engineer. And it's kind of simple. And then they know, right, I need to sell X amount of this. Great. Mm-hmm. And then we think about, okay, so what's the process and how are we going to do this? And how do you want that interaction to go with customers? So I'm beginning to program them to think about what they want, not what they don't want.
Yeah. And coming back to know and do on this point then. So what was the seed? So you coach people, you mentor people, you train people, but fundamentally you really help people. But when you said know and do, what was your driver then? What was your purpose around setting it up in the first place and doing what you do now? Because you've been doing it for like 15 years, haven't you? So what was your route into setting up know and do? What was your purpose behind it?
I think I've got to a point where I'm kind of influenced a lot by the car crash early on, and the things had changed at the university, and I went to another meeting that I came out of thinking, that was not worth trading my time for. Yeah. And I remember turning around to Bernard, who I work with now, and I just said, the fun tray's empty. And there seems to be more things getting in the way of the stuff that I really like to do. So we decided to leave the university. And then it was a case of saying, okay, we know what we want to do. And we also knew there was an appetite for people who wanted access to knowledge but to be able to use it in an applied way. And I think universities, as good as they are, one of the real bugbears I had, that when I went around to talk to practitioners, an incredibly small percentage, like 1 or 2%. So if I've got an audience there, 200 people, and they were practitioners, and I asked them how many of them would actively read journals and articles published by sports scientists and, professors, etc., and use those articles to influence their daily practice, about 1 or 2% of the audience would reply. And I was just sat there going, so what do the other 98 do? And I thought, we're losing the plot here, where we're publishing stuff in journals which people can't access. An average journal article will probably cost you £20 to £40 to access. And then, you might need 20 of those to formulate some ideas and then put them into practice. And by the time something gets published in a journal, the speed of publication means that genuinely it's out of date. Because there might be a 2-year, time delay for something to be researched and published.
Wow.
And nowadays, with the speed of the internet, 2 years, it's out of date. So what we wanted to do was start going out to businesses who wanted access to this knowledge and show people, one, they had a lot of knowledge themselves, they just didn't know how to put it together, and then start to make sure that people could do this in a more applied way, and also set up the data systems where they began to capture data, translate it into information, and develop their own knowledge banks. And for us, there was quite simple frameworks we could do to put that in place and help people.
And with what you do now, what's your biggest challenge when you're working with people? Like, as a coach, is it, what's the hardest thing? What's the hardest part of your job? What is it that challenges you?
That's a great question, Dave.
I came loaded with it.
Yeah, and I suppose it's finding people that really want change.
Right, yeah.
Because lots of people say, I want this, I want that. But when you get down to it, is do they?
Yeah.
Do they really want to change? Because we can do incredible things, and I've seen it. I love fitness, and I've always trained, but I've trained with some people, and you can tell when somebody wants it, because they'll put the work in, they'll ask for help, and there's a lot of people that sort of play at things. And jump on a trend, etc. I think the other thing is that we don't create enough time to allow people to have a safe space to sort of really stop and think about what they want. And I think that can be a challenge in allowing people to let go of the mask and reveal themselves. And from my perspective, there is a challenge there that, there's a reverence that comes with what I do.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of really weird because you create a safe space, and there's a lot of that comes with that. People buy from people they know, like, and trust. But when you're coaching, that trust goes to another level, I think. So I think there is a challenge there to keep grounded. I have a coach. Well, I have several coaches, actually, people I'll check in with, because I think it's important.
Yeah.
I've seen people get carried away with their own importance, and think that they're doing this. And, as I always remind people, as a coach, I don't do anything to a client. It's the client that does the work. My job is to create the conditions to allow the client to step into that. Yeah, I've got tools and I've got models I can share with them, but fundamentally, my job is not to create dependency. It's to allow that person to take the next steps and to support them to do that and hold them accountable. Yeah,
great answer. I think, I've known you for 10 years and that's exactly how you've done it with me. And it is interesting because I suppose when you coach people, you've got, it intertwines, doesn't it? Professionally and personally, it overlaps. And having that safe space is really important, and that time to figure out, like you said, what it is you do want, what outcomes are you after. Another interesting topic is leadership, right? So, as you know, I've seen leadership, good and bad, in sport and in business. What is leadership to you? Like, how would you describe leadership?
Leadership is really setting the vision. So it's setting the vision and giving people that direction and allowing people to come on board and work with you and move forward. And I think there's a big distinction between leadership and management. Is one of those things. It's like coaching and mentoring. People chuck the words around and they never get to the bottom of actually defining them. So one of the things that I would share is we have a model we use, which is define, design, deliver, and implement. So everything starts with a definition. So if we're going to do anything, so you mentioned leadership. If I was looking at leadership and management, I'd go and find a definition of leadership and I'd find a definition of management. And then I'd look to say, okay, with that definition, what does that then do in terms of a design that I can structure that would allow that? So for management, we use, management is planning, organising, leading and controlling of available assets and resources to achieve organisational aims as effectively and efficiently as possible. Now, that's from the Open University. It wasn't written as a definition. It was hidden in the middle of a course I was doing with them. And it was one of those sentences I just looked at and I went, wow, that is a brilliant definition of management. Because for me, if I break that down, if the leader's job is to inspire and motivate and set the direction, the manager's job is to do the execution. It is to say, okay, so how are we going to do that? So I think leadership needs to go back to understanding, what it is we want to do. And there's something there about setting the parameters, the mission, the values, and then bringing it back and an understanding where leadership then passes the baton on to management. And I think those two areas, there's a lot of confusion. There's a lot of people spouting nonsense and adding to the confusion. And I would always say to someone, if you're unclear, go and find a definition, because that really helps people to understand where their sometimes wonky thinking has emerged from.
Yeah. I think it's an interesting point you made there, because as you know, I'm somebody that likes structure and planning and things. And recently, like probably my biggest use of, say, AI at the minute, although I'll use AI to cut this podcast up, I'll use it for other things. The thing I get the most out of it is definitions of something. So quick now, like, something, mostly it's ChatGPT, but you are right. Like, when we started IsThisYou, and I had to really brush up on things like what's the difference between coaching, mentoring, training, consulting, because it does get interwoven, and it was quite interesting how I've learned the definitions and working with them. I'm evolving with them. But when I ran a business for 15 years, I didn't really clearly know them, if that makes sense. And other topics as well. Like leadership had a good grounding in, but other parts of business functions or business definitions and things like that, I just genuinely didn't know. It was made up of maybe what I've read online, socials, influences, things like that. But that is something I continuously use, as well as the odd recipe for cooking. But how do you, just in terms of knowing doing you in yourself, how do you see AI coming in to impact people that you coach? And like, do you think, personally, I've seen a lot of people are quite confused by it all. There's a lot of fear around AI, but people don't actually understand it, but they're scared of it. Have you witnessed any of that? How do you feel people feel about AI landing in business? Because taking jobs, things like that, how is it affecting people from what you see?
I think that I wrote an article on this for someone actually recently, and it's really interesting. If we look back in history, everything changes. We came out the caves, someone discovered fire allowed acceleration of certain things, someone developed the wheel that allowed, so there's constant change. And this is exactly the same. We had thousands of people working in the fields and someone produced a thresher. And then you had less people working in the fields, but then you had more people building thresher machines. So there's an evolution. And I think that AI is probably akin to the internet in terms of the scale of the potential evolution. But I don't think it's necessarily going to take jobs. I think those jobs just will become redundant at one level. I think the way the media portrays things, there's lots of fear mongering. But again, go back and look at the definition. Because you mentioned AI and you said ChatGPT. And if this was one of those quizzes and, give me the top 10 answers, but DeepSeek, Gemini, Copilot, whatever. We would come up with a list of them, but that's not AI. Those are large language learning models. So again, we're back to definitions. When we're talking about something, let's define it, because AI is a multiple of different things. It's a massive umbrella. So for me, this is about getting people to engage and understand and not just look superficially. Because if we can dig beneath that, AI has got lots of great potential, which can add an awful lot of value, but it will be adopted in different ways and people can choose how they want to use it.
Yeah.
And I think, just jumping on bandwagons and thinking we're going to chase a bit of AI and sign up for this and buy some Bitcoin and go way beyond that. I think what people aren't doing enough of is stopping and saying, hold on, what do I want? What do I need for me and my business? And have I gone and spoke to someone that can give me an idea of, if this is a tool or a set of tools, are those tools relevant for me? And if they are, how are they relevant? And what sort of value might they add? And if I don't use them, where I might be losing out? Because they're not for everybody.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, because I've learned how to use large language models, I suppose, and other AI type tools by using them and by asking how to use them. And that's been it's a bit like what you said before about definitions. It's exactly how I've used them. I do find a lot of people that talk about it haven't used anything. Some, yes, out of fear, some just want to jump on a bandwagon and say they've used it. But one thing I'm very interested in with it, I suppose for my own personal uses, which I think will happen more this year, is AI agents, because they're not quite there yet from what I've seen. But a friend of mine in Newcastle's kind of gives me, basically she runs an AI company. But that's something that I'm fascinated by. But also that does quite scare me, the use of agents. Yes, you can be really efficient on certain levels of, say, I don't know, automation or productivity and stuff, right? But for me, it removes us out of the picture. Whereas, like a large language model, it's got all this information and it needs the interaction with us. Whereas an agent, if an agent goes off and picks and chooses what it wants to do, any mistakes could be compounded. But then again, it could be really useful and really positive. But that's where I think I start to get a bit scared, if I'm honest, about what, in the wrong hands, this could be quite dark. And in the right hands, it could be brilliant, when you think cancer research and all these kind of things. But I do think AI agents, it's a great distinction what you're saying, because you are correct. A lot of people, and I've just done it, a lot of people say AI, when in fact it's an LLM. You're absolutely right. And a useful analogy, I think I've heard it on TikTok the other day, which is another source of my knowledge. TikTok was, if you see it a bit like an LLM, is a bit like if you've got a baby and you give it a book, and it reads all that book, all the words in that book. Then if you give it that book in French or different languages, it gets all of that. If you let it go out the door, that's when it goes into being an agent. And it can interact with the world and make its own decisions and all of that. And that's the scary part, when you remove us out of it. It's a bit like parenting. You can teach your kids certain things and give them structure, but when they go out in the world, they become like that agent. You know what I mean? They make their own decisions based on how they interact with the world. But that, to me, the AI agent bit is going to be, I think it's going to be wild. I think it's going to be crazy the next couple of years.
Yeah. I mean, they said the same about the internet. They said the same about, motor cars. I love, the scientist in me loves looking back at data and saying, that cars, if people drove over 40 miles an hour, people would have heart attacks and die because they couldn't consume oxygen in a rate quick enough, and people couldn't run the 4-minute mile until they did. So I think that we're at this point where some of it we're beginning to second guess and overthink. For me, it's come back because, something you and I have shared in the past, it's be in the moment, be present. In me creating a space and an environment that a coachee steps into, all of a sudden, all of that stuff goes out. Because now we're dealing with right now. What's somebody thinking now? What's their fear now? Because something that might happen 15, 10 years down the line, we can't control that. I've got to be aware of it, but I bring people back to this point of now and say, okay, but what can we do right now? And then someone says, well, this could be a problem. Okay, so do you think it would be, a big problem, a significant problem? Right. So what investment could you make in trying to understand that? Who could I go and talk to? Who can educate me? Not following the headlines. I think the worry for me is that people, by using algorithms and by logging on to things, they press buttons and they just get fed more and more of the same stuff.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think what we've got to do sometimes is disrupt that and realise, unplug to enable us to reset our parameters. Because I think AI is getting much smarter to the point where people will not realise they're having an interaction. But still, those things you can see, but it's a pick and choose thing. It's what do I want to do? How's that going to potentially impact my business? And what's going to move? Because if you get into the whole world of data analytics, it's not about what's happening in the next 10 years. Things are happening now in the space of somewhere like TikTok, of trends. We're seeing seasonal trends operating in 2 to 4 week boundaries, and even less sometimes. And if you're positioned to take account of that, you can have a business that develops really well. But on the flip side of that, you still look at someone like Warren Buffett, and he's still slaying it by using the old principles, which is buy something that people will use for a long time and don't sell it. And that's all his shares are. He buys stuff he understands, which is famously, he didn't buy any Apple stock for years because he didn't understand that. Well, don't know that game. But I think there are big shifts, but people need to sort of not get caught up in the hype and come back to themselves. What do I need to know? Is there something that I could get? Because AI is on phones, it's on all sorts of things. But I'll give you a real-time example. Someone I do a lot of pro bono mentoring, and I've been working with a young lad, and I gave him some suggestions. He's a personal trainer, and he's doing really well. But I said, you could do with going reading this book and just looking at this particular aspect in the book. And he came back to me about a day later and he said, it was really good. But he got ChatGPT, other AI models are available, by the way, but to go and give him a summary of the book, the salient points, but specifically to give him the overview of this one thing. It was a pricing model, a structure for a type of a program. And he went, it's brilliant. And I was just like, now that is really good, because he's gone and he's utilised it in a way which suits him. And I've said, go and have a look at that. If you think you need to check it, go back to the book as well. But I think for me, there are some ways here of speeding up access to information, with the caveat as well that, is it the right information? But we always should check that anyway. Just because something's published doesn't mean it's good. And for every publication I read that tells me one thing, I can find another that tells me the opposite.
Exactly. The same with data. Like I've always said with data, when I had the agency, like somebody can say it one way and 3 other people can say it another way. It's how you interpret it. Final question then. Let's see if there's people watching this now that are thinking about getting a coach and maybe they've never had one before. What should they look out for in a company or a person that they want, that's going to coach them? What advice would you give to people?
I'd say do your research. First off, think about why you want to coach and what you think a coach is going to add to yourself. There are lots of models of coaching that are available, and there's some coaches have picked up a franchise model, nothing wrong with those, but I would say you've got to find somebody that you connect with. You've got to have a connection with somebody to be able to step into a space and share. So not so much a piece of paper, but I think you need a coach that has got really good communication skills and is good at listening and gives you the space to unpack. And the only way you're going to really know that is word of mouth recommendations, checking people out and seeing where you get to. The other thing I think that coaching for me, you don't need to coach someone for a long time. I love it when a client sort of has an awkward conversation, awkward on their part, saying, I kind of need to just let you go. Can I stop now? Because I think I'm fixed. And I'm like, yeah, great. But I also love it when they come back about 2 years later and they go, I've got something going on. Company needs to grow a bit more. Can we come in and just have a chat? And I think people need to look at different coaches. If you went back into football now, nutrition coaches, sleep coaches, rest coaches, recovery coaches, exercise specialists, and you'll have, physios, but it's no longer just general physios. You might have a physio for neuro conditions. You might have a physio for legs. So I think the idea of having multiple coaches is useful. Finance coaches, business coaches, personal coaches. But I think you've got to dig beneath that and think, what do I want? Because you said something earlier, and I come across this a lot, that personal professional boundary, it doesn't really exist. So what I mean by that is, as a person walks into the business, they're bringing all their personal stuff with them. But nobody's got to switch. Believe you me, I've worked with some people whose job it is to put on a different persona and not to be spotted for that. They're easy to read. So I think the thing is, if people think that they can turn one thing off and become another, it doesn't. So you've got to find a coach that you're comfortable with being able to share sometimes. I'm having a bad day. I'm having a bad week. Something's gone on. Could be you've got a parent who's ill or something, and then you're looking at that and saying, yeah, if that's something that will impact on the business. So I need somebody that's got the ability to be able to come up with strategies and help people navigate that current landscape and that environment, but also not create dependency. So, it's a case of allowing that person to think of something, test it, go away and, then develop it, but also sometimes not allow them, because you get people come in and they go, here's my problem, tell me what to do. And I'm like, it doesn't work like that. First off, I will literally give them their problem back and then ask them to tell me why they think it's a problem. And as you do that, then you can begin, so at no point will I ever pick something up. And I think where you've got coaches who maybe haven't really developed those skills, I see some of them will take people's problems and try to fix them. It's not my job. So I think, again, go back to the definition, explore it with somebody, ask them what makes them a coach, what type of coaching do they do? Because there'll be some sort of training they've done, and you've got to have a look and think, well, is that the right thing for me?
No, that's a fantastic answer, and it's you've been doing it for 15 years, and it's very well done. It's very well rounded, and I couldn't agree more with it, to be honest. Okay, that'll wrap it up there. But we'll have to have our usual brew at the M&S Cafe as we normally do.
Yeah.
But no, thanks for coming on. It's been a it's a pleasure having you on the podcast. There's loads of golden nuggets that you've given us there. And is there anything else you want to mention before we switch off?
I think one thing, it's prompted really by what you were saying about AI. I think there's a power in human relationships, and I think it's a power that we're not building enough. So, I'm going to throw a bit of love back to you here with what you're creating with IsThisYou. When I saw that, God, what a great title. But it's the sense of what you're building is a collective community. And it's a collective community of different range of skills and knowledge, wanting to give back, but most importantly, to engage with people. Now, you'll embrace AI and technology as we're doing now to get that message out. But fundamentally, you're taking a people-centered approach. And I think that, we're missing a lot of that. I think actually we do need to get together and start to create opportunities like this, share some snippets, but also remind people, hey, you can do that. If you want to get involved, reach out, go to one of the workshops, because for me, it is about that connectivity. It's about people being able to be honest with themselves and ask for support. And I think you're creating and curating a safe, expert community. So, I just wanted to acknowledge that, because I think for people who are worried about saying, get involved with some of the stuff that you're doing and others like you are doing, because that's one sure way to make sure that we've got that collective support.
Yes, you're absolutely right. I mean, it's how we've approached this whole thing is, it's a brand that supports the community. It supports other coaches, and for me, when I had my agency, I got on really well with other agencies, right? And we're still friends today. It's the same here, like we've got plenty of coaches, we've got other coaching companies, people like yourself know and do. And yes, we've still got things to learn. We've got gaps in our knowledge. Other people can fill them. But then also just collectively, fundamentally, it is about people. You're absolutely right. It's about people and fundamentally helping people. So no, thanks for that. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome, Dave.
Thank you. Right, we'll clock it there, and yes, well, let's have that M&S brew or a pint. I think we deserve a pint at some point soon as well.
Yeah.
All right.
Good to see you, Dave.
All right.
Cheers,
Cheers, Andrew.
mate. Bye.